All right, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Final day after lunch. Hopefully the carb counts aren't too high and we'll keep you as engaged as possible. So just always like to get a feel for, in the audience, anybody, before we start pulling down the road, contract manufacturers, anybody related to that business in the office? Okay, one there, two there, three there. So you're a CMO or design house. Outstanding. No secrets. Don't give away the secrets. Okay, and those using a CMO somewhere in their business right now or thinking about selecting a CMO? Great. Okay, just so I know, because it is a workshop and I want to try and offer as much value as possible across the board. And I'd also like to include some of the CMOs in some of the dialogue as well. Battle test it. So gentlemen, why don't we start with introductions? Bryan on the end there, and we'll work it back my way.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bryan Lord. I'm the CEO of Pristine Surgical. We're located in the greater Boston area, actually in what I like to call the tax-free zone of the greater Boston area in New Hampshire, just across the border. There's a story there why we're there, which we'll get to. We make single-use arthroscopes. So you can think about it as a kitted scope that has a component that's a razor blade side of things, and then it plugs into a piece of capital equipment as well. So we'll talk more about the product as we go.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm David Van Slingerland, the CEO of Sterling Industries. We are a CDMO. We've been in business for 40 years. We are headquartered in Toronto, but we have facilities in the Midwest, in Michigan as well. We produce products. In the first 30 years, we produced products only for the strategics. And then in the last 10 years, as the make versus buy decisions by strategics have occurred, we're now moving downstream to work with scale-ups and startups, because that's where probably most of the innovation and product development comes from, and they need help to get to commercialization.
So to that point, let's start there, and then I want Bryan's journey to you. As a contract manufacturer, what dynamics have you seen in the last 5 to 7 years, customer base, customer acquisition, and the things you look for before you take on a partner?
Sure. So evolutionary. The strategics were taking on much more risk early, so they were looking for startups. That has now evolved to scale-ups. So we originally started to work in the scale-up space. So what's a scale-up? Somebody who's got regulatory approval, somebody that may have a minor, small commercialized footprint and has a proven product. Now we're starting to see the evolution as the strategics and even investors have moved to post-commercial companies. Now the burden of development is moving earlier, and the assistance that is required, because now you don't have the strategics helping their investments along to get to commercialization. You now have the startups that have to kind of go it alone. And as we know, resources are finite in the startup world. And so they need resource augmentation, and they need somebody that probably knows the roadmap of how to get to commercialization.
Got it. And Bryan, so that's where you enter with Pristine. Share, at least, give me the arc of the story as valuable and as brief as you can, of how did you show up on Sterling's doorstep, and were you already producing or were you in ideation?
Yeah. So I think if you think about sort of the myriad of different case studies that a group like Sterling could have, or all contract manufacturers could have, you've got a full spectrum of sort of turnkey and let's optimize, to all the way on the other end of the spectrum where you're really even pre-ideation, if you will. So we were much more towards that end of the spectrum. So the company was founded, we like to say we were virtual before virtual was cool, kind of as a necessity. So the original platform for Pristine was developed by a couple of surgeons, had an idea. That actually moved to a relationship with the contract development group called DECA Research in southern New Hampshire, in the in Manchester, New Hampshire. So all of our first generation research is really done specifically there at DECA with a virtual organization around it. making sure that we have investment that comes in, docs that are advising, but the contract development work was really done in partnership with DECA. Their whole strategy and their development very clear mandate is to get to a proof of concept and preferably to a 510K. So I think everybody knows the kind of standard approach that oftentimes companies take, where you do a two-step approach to a 510K approval, and we did that. So we got a proof of concept on the initial 510K, and our engagement then with DECA was complete. So now what? Go find somebody who can help build it. You expect that some elements of that prototype then transition into the manufacturing side of things, kind of, in a straightforward basis. And you also expect that you have to do some DFM in order to move to the high scale side of things. And so that's when the search began. As I recall, we got introduced because Sterling had a particular relationship or a particular capability in a critical component for our device. And so, many different serendipitous ways that you meet people, that's where it started. And from there, we started to understand a little bit more about the breadth of their capabilities that really was beyond just that singular component. And so then we pushed off from shore, and said, okay, now what we need to do is develop this from a manufacturing perspective. So I give you that somewhat lengthy, in spite of your admonition to keep it brief, somewhat lengthy story, because you can see how early it was that we actually started to engage. And so what was most important for us at that stage was somebody who had the ability to scale, certainly. And I knew, given the client base that Sterling had, that they, support the best of the best in the industry, but also a willingness to come very early on a comparative perspective, right? So we had at least some proof of concept and regulatory approval in hand, but boy, we didn't know what we didn't know in terms of what we needed to do in order to alter the device and do the DFM to get it into the kind of production that we have today. Look, there's a competition for the business. And so there's a competition for the business that occurs sort of from a sales perspective, but then there's a competition for the business that also occurs from the engineering perspective. And without revealing too much about the extent of my liberal arts background, it's pretty hard for a liberal arts major to actually discern. You can do the sales side of things and kind of figure out what's going on there, but how you actually discern and weigh the competing, approaches from the engineering perspective. So that's challenging, but part of it. It just is. And so, you've got some sort of preferred methodologies that might be reflective of the core competencies of those groups, and I think that certainly was reflective in this case. And you have to listen carefully, and you have to ask some, I think, important questions to try to understand whether it's just better or whether it's preferred. And those are tough processes, but natural, right?
Yeah. So one of the things I want to go back to, rewind the story a little bit, because there's a lot of founders at this event, and generally who you pick to start out with determines a lot of things that happen well and less optimally moving downrange. So when you went into DECA, right? So those who don't know DECA, Dean Kamen's a legend for all righteous reasons, but you're getting an ideation house. You're not necessarily getting a house that's thinking about volumes downrange as much as they should have in the volumes that you're in, and in an emerging market with single-use scopes, right? So in a redo, what would you wish you had known when you inked the first contract with Dean or DECA that would have changed some other decision-making downrange? That's question number one, and I have a question number two after that.
It's a good question. I don't know that. Look, David might say, so correct me if I'm wrong, that perhaps if you came with a surgeon and a really basic prototype that wasn't anywhere close to what it needed to be, that you could take that and start from there. But I think that, the way it worked out in hindsight is probably the way that, about the way it should, which is that you got a doc who, as I remember the interview that Dean did with respect to the early days of Pristine, where he said, you almost can, kind of replay the tape in my head. He said, look, it wasn't the nature of the prototype that was really compelling to them looking at this as an opportunity, but it was really about the docs communicating need, and that there was need in the market for some innovation in the space. It was Dean's idea to do to take the prototype and make it single use. And I think when the docs saw identified a need and took a swing at a relatively rudimentary prototype, Dean come in and said, I don't really care about your prototype, but I understand the need. What can we do, and how can we do it in a way that actually advances where he knows better than most where technology is going? We can do this in single use, knowing where microelectronics are going and everything else. Everybody's eyes got big and said, let's do that. Let's address the need, and let's do it in a way that's forward-looking. And I think, look, not to pat ourselves in the back too much, forward-looking beyond what we knew that forward-looking would look towards. This was long before you sort of understood what digital technology in, this conference would be talking about as a sort of...
What year was that?
Oh gosh, that was 8 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe 9. So those, you don't get that type of perspective about the future from very many people, and that's why Dean Kamen's Dean Kamen, right?
Yeah.
And I think we were very fortunate then to start with that type of forward thinking. And then what we had to do was kind of build into that vision. So we had to build into that vision from a prototype perspective, and they said, okay, we've done our job. And, obviously we'll help with the transition, help with, some introductions and the like, but Dean wants to go back and solve the next big problem.
Correct.
Right? That's his world-class sweet spot. So then we transitioned and filled that in. So I guess it's a good and a fairly, as usual, Joe, a provocative question, but I don't know that we would have gotten there if we would have sort of, not had that sort of push the envelope visionary introduction and then transitioned to then fully ability to reach back and sort of grab that and take that into high volume production. The combination of those two things, frankly, has been, I think, critical for us to be able to do what we needed to do. This has been a tougher technology lift than I think even Dean would have thought, certainly more than I would have thought, probably more than you've would have thought. But without those sort of two yin yangs, I don't know that we could have built the bridge.
So David,
others have failed.
as Bryan shows up on your doorstep with this prototype, so to speak, working prototype, as a CDMO, what are you looking at when you assess whether you want this as a customer base?
So I think one of the things that we apply to all folks that show up at our doorstep, everything from the mad scientist doctor who's got this great revelation to folks that have already serially delivered medical devices. But in many ways, we think similar to how an investor would think. And what I mean by that is, you look at, one of the first questions we ask is, what's your TAM? And if they don't even know what a TAM is, then we know that the direction of the conversation is going to go elsewhere. But it's really understanding, does it have legs? And has the person bringing the idea to you thought this through? What's their market share going to be? So if they say, yeah, we're going to sell, 1 million of these things. So Bryan was actually able to articulate that as a point of reference. 1 million is 4%, I think, of all procedures. So that's a pretty modest. That's a pretty modest number to say, yeah, we're happy with 4% of the market. If you have somebody who shows up and says, yeah, I'm going to get 80% of the market, and then you just starts like, really? Unless there's nobody else, if you're making something for maybe Antarctic penguins or something like that. But
why is that important to know? Because are you making heavy investments in the beginning and later in the game?
Yeah, so it comes in a variety of ways. Most of it's opportunity cost. So, our engineering team is a finite commodity. They're expensive guys. And I don't want to assign them to a project that is going to go away in 2 months out of the gate, either because the device owner is just doesn't have their act together, or they don't even have the money. And that's the other part of it. Do you know what it takes to commercialize? Do you know all the steps that you have to go through? It's not just about getting regulatory approval. That's I don't want to say the easy part, but it's how do you then commercialize it after you have your 510K? What are all, it's not inexpensive. And there's a lot of people that get sticker shock from all of the regulatory work you have to do, process validations, equipment validations. Maybe you have to get capital equipment. you have to decide, even we decide, are we going to do everything internally or are we going to outsource some of the stuff? So you have to go through this entire process to understand what are we really signing up for.
So you really are an investor to a certain extent through the vetting process and the diligence process, and you'll look at that and oftentimes ask to go through that as if you were going to be writing a check, because in essence, you kind of are writing a check.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, Brian, were you ready for that experience as a first-timer?
Well, I think so. I think that I knew how much we needed for that CM to reach back. And as a result, you know that you need somebody who's willing to invest in a fairly, significant pathway. Again, I think we learned that pathway had a longer, stretch to it than perhaps we expected. But nevertheless, I think we were well aware that there are the large behemoths that you've got to come to with 10 million units to, get a return phone call from. And so you needed to look for a select capability, interest, willingness, entrepreneurial mindset, to move earlier necessarily. Look, in some cases, that just happens naturally. Those folks select themselves out. But I think we had an instinct that we needed, to find a partner that was willing to, you can call it what you want, but invest is a really good word.
When do you make a decision as a business owner and a founder to not have a backup plan in case the CDMO becomes insolvent or resource constrained? Because I've seen that happen from my side many, many times.
So I have always...
It's like a relationship. I'm asking if you ever cheated on, right?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Joe. Look, David, you can choose how you disclose your customer base, but David's got, at Sterling, customers that are amongst the bluest of the blue chips and the youngest of the young bucks, and in between. It's always given me confidence that if it's good enough for the bluest of the blue chips, it's going to be good enough for us. And they're probably more aggressive in discerning that question than I need to be, especially given our funding, relative funding, startup pathways that you have to go through. So I've always had a lot of confidence given the company that I was able to keep in the portfolio of customers that I knew I was a part of.
Mm-hmm. And earlier in the conversation, I was listening because, I know both of you very well for a couple of years, but not knowing all this story, it's almost as if you took a partnership role as a Sherpa for him when I think about you going to Korea with him, because obviously who were the other subs in the relationship, you had a stake in their success as well, because the kind of final came to you, right? Is that very typical from your experience? Do you take that much of a partnership role, or does the founder, owner, strategic, or small emerging tech company decide where you play with them?
Well, certainly our approach is to be partners. As I tell people, we don't take transactional business. So if somebody comes to me and says, can you build me 100,000 of these and we'll shake hands and see each other maybe in the future, that's not the type of business. I call that rental business. I want long-term partnerships. Like we have partnerships with some of our strategics that have been in place for 25 years. So that is a commitment to the partnership and a commitment to how we want to do business. So I would much rather prefer that than somebody who's just going to dump something on my lap and say, please make it and we'll see you later. Mm-hmm. Now we did have that through COVID, obviously, because it wasn't maybe necessarily the person's prerogative to do that, but COVID ended, thankfully, and the need for the products that we were making ended. So there's entrepreneurs sitting in this room, and there were Bryan was with Pristine 6-7 years ago. What is your list that they should be going to a CDMO with that would allow them to have the most robust potential experience vetting process and final decision-making process as they go out and evaluate those? For you? Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah, you're sitting there and somebody knocks on your door with a scope 7 years ago.
So I think there's a couple of things: understanding the market, understanding what is MVP for that product set, and also the understanding where like a self-realization of where the gaps are. What do they have? What don't they have from a knowledge base? Do they have engineering resources? Do they have ideation resources? Have they done this before? Are key things. And the other thing is also a willingness to iterate. And lastly, don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. Because I can tell you, and for those of you who have delivered devices, the first thing you deliver is not going to be perfect. And maybe by design, maybe you don't want to deliver all features immediately. But in general, you're going to get market feedback. You can do as much market research as you want, but if you're inserting your product into case flow, you're going to get, you're going to have 10 doctors who will give you 15 opinions on how they should use the device, right? So this is how we expect that the founder and their organization want to work. And we find that that's probably the most synergistic, and and we're in it to be partners. If you think about it, a design house, when the design ends, the music stops and the checks stop, right? Because the design's over with. So you could argue that there's some reluctance for the design house to finish the design because they want to keep getting paid. In our case, our goals are very much aligned with the founders' goals, which is they want to sell, and if they sell, we get to make, because ultimately we're first manufacturers. All of these other things we do are means to an end. Like even, we're very vertically integrated. We have injection molding, we have machine shops, we have lots of other toys that the engineers get to play with and the ops people get to play with. But those are all a means to an end. At the end of the day, it's about creating commercialized product to sell in the marketplace.
Yeah. If I may, if there are first-time founders in the audience that are sort of thinking through the same thing and wondering, gosh, what a complex, process to work through. Yes, but I think it's actually really pretty simple. I always think about in almost any interaction, whether the interests are aligned or whether they're divergent. If you start there and say, align your interests, the rest of it falls into place. If you have misaligned interests, it's almost impossible to actually do the things you need to do. It's just a fundamental, criteria. So David, your comments sort of triggered that thought in my mind. It was clear in the way that our initial discussions went that there was no resistance, in fact, consensus around making sure that interests were aligned from the beginning. That gives you a lot of confidence that the details can be figured out underneath it, number one. And I think number two, if you have the opportunity to work with a CM where you know that you get access to the top guy, that makes a big difference as well. I think as I look back, I didn't know any different. I just expected that was the case. You chat with I think that's rare. And so David, to your credit, look, we've been on conference calls this week together, about a few things that we're fine tuning. So, it's very different. You can, myriad of different avenues, but if you can align interests and have personal, and over time, build a relationship. We've had a lot of dinners together. We've traveled to places together. And then what you have is an alignment of interest and really, at the end of the day, trust. Mm-hmm. So you can have all kinds of stuff where you talk about, injection molding techniques and bonding, blah, blah, blahs and all that sort of thing. But to me, those are two of the most fundamental things that I look back on and why this partnership worked. It sounds a little kumbaya, but that's the base, reality of, I think the rest of it falls into the details when you can get those two things right.
As both business owners and both always concerned about, rightfully so, about economics and funding, is there ever a time that you've considered having a piece of the action in a partner and shared on that? And have you ever thought about back and forth sharing that with whoever vendors? I know what happens in the search business is we will preserve cash and take skin in the game on those. Does that ever occur? Should any of the entrepreneurs out here think about that with relationships?
They're your shares, so I'm not going to say anything.
They're your shares too.
Well, they are.
Well, there's my answer. Anyway, next question, right?
No, I think.
Look, I think that's an important thing, though, because we do it as well. And it just sends a signal to the partner, like, I'm in this with you. I've got X in the game, so I didn't mean if that wasn't supposed to be asked.
I was smirking because I want to let him answer. This goes out, but if you piggyback on the previous comment, there's no better way to align your interests together than for you to be, aligned as shareholders. And we're grateful to have David and Sterling as a shareholder in the company. So that weaves it even deeper. If you're looking for even further distinction, look, that's not a requirement. That's a really cherry on top, but it certainly does solidify the alignment of interest.
Yeah. You want to add anything to that? You just go to the next question.
I think there's other things other than being a shareholder. And, somebody asked me one day, well, if Pristine didn't make it, is it going to topple your business or affect your business? And, and the answer is no. But, sorry. But, I think we're on the journey together. So I've been in investor meetings. Bryan's brought me to investor meetings because the investors asked, who's making this thing for you? Mm-hmm. What, can they achieve your vision? So, so I've been trotted out on a few occasions to explain, it's sort of coming from the horse's mouth as opposed to Bryan saying, yeah, trust me, to the investors or possible investors even.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing. Now, I don't know if other CMs do that or would be willing to do that, but certainly that's, back to we're all in. We are all in.
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty powerful statement, is to bring it to investors. And to your point, if you're looking for money, you're going to be biased in their eyes, but bring out the contract manufacturing partner or manufacturing partner. Let's leave the contract manufacturing partner out. I think that's critical.
Absolutely.
What didn't we cover here that we should have covered? I know we only have a couple minutes left. Is there anything in particular I think would be valuable for the audience? And if there are any questions while I'm doing this, hands up, certainly feel free to that. But what didn't we talk about?
Not specific to Pristine, but, I think I also look at why we have other folks come to us from other CMOs. So they're looking to leave their current CMO for a variety of reasons. Typically, quality is a concern. Scalability is a concern. We've had situations where the CMO went bankrupt and right on the eve of commercialization, and they've come to us. And then the last one is capability. And so we've taken on a number of assignments where we've done a manufacturing transfer of Gen 1 and continued to make that in the marketplace. And then we've been involved in the evolution and the design of Gen 2, which is typically a variation on the theme of Gen 1. It's just an improvement. But again, we get experience under our belt of Gen 1, but then we're making Gen 2. And many CMs that are assembly houses only, don't have extensive engineering teams like we do, can't play in that game. And so there is a cost to move your manufacturer. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing to consider. Where are you in your journey? Do you expect, are you going to go in for the cheap and cheerful guy to start with, and then, graduate when, you've gotten some traction, whether it be from an investment perspective or from a market acceptance perspective. So that's the other thing you have to also think about, is what is the ultimate journey of your device and what's your exit look like? The other benefit that somebody like us adds is because the strategics have long been our customers. If you think about it, if your exit is to sell to a strategic, it becomes a turnkey sale, because the strategic can just show up and say, hey, we just bought Pristine or whomever it is, stop shipping it to Bryan over here and start shipping to our distribution center over there. And by the way, can you please make 10x of them? We're involved with other strategics that they're looking at buying a product, and they will come and ask us, okay, you're at 50,000 a year right now, maybe. We want to do 500,000, 750,000. Tell me how you're going to get there, or how you can do that with this product. Mm-hmm. And so we're happy to do that, to show that there is a plan. And, I think the strategics are more about, you look at somebody like J&J, they would prefer not to make anything, within reason, of course. And then you get others who want to make everything or most things. But for those that want a turnkey solution, that's another thing to look for.
Mm-hmm. Bryan, anything as we close out here that you want to share that we didn't talk about?
I think one thing that occurred to me also for the first time CEOs is that this sounds rather kind of step functioning in the way that I sort of described the relationship. What really happens, though, as well, that's important to sort of foreshadow is as you initiate the relationship with a CM, your enterprise is developing at the same time. And we went from a very small level of participation with, gosh, sort of 95-5 in terms of the percentage of people from Pristine and the percentage of people at Sterling to now a much more balanced configuration. You sort of grow into that relationship, and that's important. At the end of the day, you want to have, a balance where you can lean against each other and bring something to the table on both sides. But that's been an intentional effort on our part. It might sound a little counterintuitive that as you go, shouldn't you sort of rely more and more and more on your CM? And we actually have gone the opposite way. What we said is we need to actually build more capability in order to be good partners together with the CM. And so that's something to sort of expect as you mature, as moving towards that development phase. Towards that manufacturing phase, that you got to bring some additional investment to the table as on the company side.
Great question.
My question is about tariffs.
Changing tariffs and more about sourcing. So we have electronics from Southeast Asia, cameras from India. How do you think this is going to affect production costs, margins for manufacturers in the United States, and ultimately inventory and lead time for companies like us?
So we've certainly had lots of conversations with lots of different customers who have a lot of different characteristics. It's a complex equation depending on where things are coming from. So you talked about a very diverse supply chain. If you think about it, labor rates, loaded labor rates, India $5, Mexico $15. We're Canadian, so we think about Canadian dollars, $20 or $28. These are all US dollars, by the way. And in the US, labor $38 loaded. So it becomes an equation of tariffs versus uplift in labor. And that's driven by how much labor content do you have in your product. If you have a very low labor content, then you're probably not concerned about bringing on a slight uplift in labor cost. But if you have a high labor content, then it's probably bringing it to the US, as an example, will probably far outstrip the money that you'd spend on tariffs. The other thing is you can do final assembly in the US. So if you think about it, if I bring in a finished device that's $1,000, I'm going to pay tariff on $1,000. If I bring in plastic components, plastic might be $1 for a piece of plastic. Now I'm only paying 25 cents on that. So you can mitigate some of the tariff risk by bringing things in pieces and then do the final assembly in the United States, where you're adding all the value and the value of the good is going to its final price. But if you do it in the U.S., you've avoided tariffs. So there's a lot more to it. Every situation is different, but I just gave you a couple of examples just to talk about, that it's not just a yes or no answer, I guess.
Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much for attending and sharing and listening. So let's hear it for our panel, please.